memory of Manabendranath Roy, an Indian revolutionary, radical, activist and political theorist, as well as a noted philosopher in the 20th century. Roy was a founder of the Mexican Communist Party and the Communist Party of India. He was also a delegate to the Congresses of the Communist International and Russia's aid to China. Following the rise of Joseph Stalin, Roy left the mainline communist movement to pursue independent radical politics. In 1940, he was instrumental in the formation of the Radical Democratic Party. This lecture is titled Capitalism, Neoliberalism and Development in Africa, the Response of the African Union, and will be delivered by Jean-Joseph Boillot on behalf of his friend Cherif Salif. Can I please request Professor Boillot to take over the proceedings?
Thank you. So, sorry to... yeah, it's okay. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the paper of Cherif Salif, even if it's read by a French, but you know Senegal is a French-speaking, and I know Cherif's accent is not better than mine. So the question is, from an African perspective, this is a paper, from an African perspective, from a Marxist perspective, because Cherif is a Marxist economist, how they see the challenge for Africa and how to understand the today challenge, but also from a historical perspective, and this is where we will remember the long text of Marx on colonialism and imperialism, but mostly colonialism. So the word Africa, nobody knows what is coming from, is of Berber origin. It means Ifrikaya. Ifri means rocks. And the continent brings together 54 states, recognized by the United Nations, means another one. The 55th is Sahrawi, no, it's not recognized. Its surface area, it's very important to understand that, is 30 million square meters, which is the largest continent in the world. It's 3 times Europe, no? No. Asia is East Asia, West Asia, etc. Yeah, okay. The large Asia, you mean. But anyway, you can put China, Europe, US, Japan into Africa, no? So the size matter a lot, is a few times more than India, no? 3 times more than India also, with the same population. Anyway, the international diplomacy of the continent has been rehabilitated recently, just for the last decade, shall I say. It is solicited, listened, its energy potential is considerable. Nearly 48 countries in Africa have oil reserve of a large quantity. Its enormous agricultural potential is the subject of a credible strategic plan of 35 countries in war in 1995. The continent doesn't know more than a few hotbeds of tension today. And that is very important to understand. It belongs to the chaos theory phenomenon to a certain extent. Nobody would have foreseen that the African continent would be so peaceful today. Even peaceful than India, shall I say. Even peaceful than India. Anyway, African young population is much better trained today. Numbers are the countries where the democratic freedoms have been restored and maintained without any recourse to the mechanism of totalitarian. The principle of national sovereignty belongs more and more to the representatives of the people. The freedom and plurality of parties by the respect of national sovereignty and democratic principles are no longer the exception. It is more and more recognized that the judiciary ensures respect of the freedom of each individuals. Africa is recovering also a good economic and financial health. Economic activity is progressing at the speed of 5% per year on average, and demographic growth is about 3, even less now. It's going down also, so the real GDP per capita is increasing on average by 2 to 3%. Despite persistent difficulties in some countries, the prospects are more favorable for the most part, which they had been for a long time. Several factors underlie this recovery, and not only the global expansion, fueled in particular by the increase in the demand for commodities. In general, growth has been fueled by the development of new deposits of oil, for sure, but the resumption of agricultural production is clear, and that's very important to understand. The image of Africa being a starving population, etc., doesn't fit what myself I observe every month when I visit Africa. The progress in agriculture can be seen everywhere, and partly thanks to China, because the link between the countryside and the big cities is today bridged by the motorcycle, the small van from China, made in China, which are very affordable, plus mobile phones, so that the rural areas are connected to the city. This is really the phenomenon which is taking place and is helping the agriculture of Africa. There is, of course, a discourse that attempts to persuade the Africans not to take into account the many reasons for the backwardness of the continent and its marginalization in world trade, nor the slave trade, and neither the colonization. Even if the triangular trade and colonization do not explain everything, they have largely contributed to justify the current situation of the continent. It is therefore legitimate to reject this form of mutilation of the history, which want to explain the place of the continent in the global trade without taking into account the major historical facts. A good understanding of the harmful effect of foreign domination requires the determination of the impact of each sequence having contributed to its materialization. The malfunctions that still exist in Africa are also largely the result of economic processes in force since World War II, especially the excesses of capitalist neoliberal policies and of uptake of natural and energy resources, which put under control the economy of the continent. These policies are even today conducted by Western and Asian multinationals, including from China, without real redistribution of wealth, despite the deterioration of the security situation in Africa. And the new course of the continent, economic challenge, and the new course of the continent economic challenge with a very promising and challenging action plan of NEPAD, and this is the core of the paper of Dr. Cherif Salif, NEPAD, adopted by Africa in the early 2000s, may be a turning point. Just briefly, because we are constrained by the time, the first part of the paper deals with the colonialism, neocolonialism, and the invention of the official development assistance during the first debt crisis of the Third War in the 80s. So I go quickly in that part, but it's very important, I think, to in this paper, not to forget the impact of the 500 years of colonialism. Africa is very early impregnated in the process of Western penetration. Its trajectory has changed since the mercantilist period to be rooted in the development of the emerging capitalism. For 5 centuries, Africa is thus dogged without interruption by outside forces. A fact unprecedented in the history of nations. For centuries, it has been considered as a reservoir of manpower by the Arabs, so it's not only Western countries, by the Arabs, the European powers, including France and England, which were involved in the triangular trade, removing from the continent nearly 15 million people for what was the traffic of black or the ebony traffic. As early as the 1880s, Europeans were increasingly interested in the mineral wealth of the African continent. They penetrated deep into their territories while opting for an exploitation of resources to the benefit of their related countries. The development of the territories, creation of road and railroad infrastructure was done primarily for the benefit of the harbors and then for the export of raw materials. The organization of the French colonial empire testified to this strategic approach. The African continent was shared by the major European powers as early as the middle of the 19th century. This led to the creation of new borders, very often artificial. That's very important to understand, because it takes time to restore the political and geopolitical condition for economic development. So this led to the creation of new borders, often artificial, not respecting the established kingdoms, because the history of Africa was like for India, it's 2000 and more old. Not respecting the established kingdom or the ethnic realities, the cutting of Africa today relies on natural elements as river lines, ridges, desert, meridians, parallel, and so on, but not human and political reality. The whole policy of established colonial systems revolve around economic exploitation, policy of assimilation or association, whether it was the French system or the British system. At the end of the Second World War, General Marshall, during a speech at the Harvard University, outlined the willingness of the government of the United States, to contribute to the recovery of Europe. The Marshall Plan was officially launched, called the European Recovery Program. In a way, never forget that in exchange of that aid, the US administration asked the Europeans to decolonize their colony, especially Africa. It was not aid as such. It was a plan, Marshall Plan, for the expansion of free trade, which had given the United States their prosperity and their dynamism, and also with the goal toward the development of communism. But the containment of communism and the enlargement of free trade to the world could not be done without the liberation of the colonies. Even if it does not, decolonization was actually a conditionality of the Marshall Plan. It was associated with the principle of development aid. The IMF, the Bretton Woods, was, I think, 1948 or 1947, mentioned specifically that new mechanism, aid, assistance, which find its origin in the speech of the State of the Union of the President Truman in 1949. So, turn now to the impact of that new Pax Americana on Africa, whether or not it was real decolonization or not. And this is what he said. The debt crisis of the 80s and the unilateral structural adjustment program of the 1990s was actually imposed by the Washington Consensus. And it has affected a lot Africa. Decolonization gave place to new mode of partnership between African countries and Western countries. These relations can be labeled as neocolonialism. One of the most harmful constraints was the unequal exchange, according to which the decline in the term of trade and the unequal sharing of profit is explained by the asymmetric progress in productivity between countries with different wages and technology. During the first decade of independence, in all the colonies, English as well as French-speaking countries, in the absence of private sector, and in the light of the rudimentary condition of infrastructure, due to that, the state assumed alone the passage from a subsistence economy to a modern economy. Unfortunately, the weight of foreign capital and the influence of the former colonial countries remained dominant, leaving the African states gradually to become predatory classes, under control of predatory classes, to structural, geographical, climatic, and epidemiologic handicap or lack of infrastructure was added that of the deteriorating domestic governance. At the beginning of the 1970s, the quasi-exclusive subordination in respect of basic product export, the absence of industrialization, as well as a very low rate of saving and investment, brought about an accumulation of debt in the African countries. Then in 1979 took place the second oil shock, which caused a 20-time increase in the price of oil, but also for Africa, a huge deterioration of its term of trade. To get out of the crisis, which was striking the Western world, in particular double-digit inflation, and actually to reaffirm their leadership in the world after the egregious failure in Vietnam, in Iran, and in Nicaragua, the US decided a sharp increase of the interest rate, which shot up from 4% to 18% and even more at the peak of the crisis. And that triggered the debt crisis of the third world, and in particular in Africa. So the fate of hundreds of million peoples now depend on the rule laid down by a few liberal experts. The so-called Washington Consensus specified 10 guidelines that states subjected to public debt were supposed to follow. In particular, deregulation or dereglementation, decompartmentalization, and disintermediation. The structural adjustment programs proved to be a total failure in Africa, with a stagnation of the GDP per capita on average during most of the 1990s, even actually a decline of the GDP per capita, because population growth being 3%, the actual growth rate was only 2%, so there was a decline for more than 10 years in the African continent. So that some African leaders decided to get rid of the Western control of their continent and launched in the early 2000s an ambitious initiative, the NEPAD. And actually, that paper is important for that reason. It explains at length, as you mentioned about China, another structural change in the world economy is the way Africa is now taking up its own destiny through the NEPAD. And it's not well known. It's very, very low profile. Everywhere know that in Africa, but otherwise nobody call about NEPAD, N-E-P-A-D. So what is NEPAD? Taking into account the evolution of the international environment and aware of the huge backwardness of Africa, the disastrous situation of its population, and the futility of endless studies and plans which never worked, that mark our history since independence, some of the Africans, head of states, took the initiative to develop plans for the development of the continent in an entirely new spirit. At the African Union Summit of Lusaka in 2001, it's important always. It means 17 years ago. 17 years ago. It was at the time of the agreement with the China to join the WTO, no? 2001. The African head of state approved the new African initiative. So, and the NAD became NEPAD, launched in 2001. What the NEPAD is and why is it a turning point for the continent? It certifies that the African countries are responsible for their development and require their share of commitment and specific obligations. NEPAD recognized that the objectives that are the responsibility of the African countries are to establish the prerequisites for development in keeping peace, stability, good governance, rule of law, democratic practices, elimination of poverty, to ensure growth and sustainable development. It's also a message, an important challenge, an important challenge for to the partners of Africa, to which it recalls them that they cannot ignore the serious problem of the continent underdevelopment at their own risk and peril. It offers them shared responsibilities, equal partner, accompanied by obligation to each other for the success or failure. The document also put the emphasis on the promotion of the role of women in all areas, but especially in the field of education. Finally, NEPAD adopted a pragmatic refusal and informed consent of the rejection of the globalization and consider that the issue, the real challenge, is to be positive in the battle for the multilateral world. Africa engaged in the globalization process through NEPAD. Why is NEPAD so important? Just to finish. Because nobody knows the real mechanism which is used to implement that NEPAD. It is called EPRM. So I am in India, you love acronyms, so I can use this acronym. EPRM, African Peer Review Mechanism. It was launched in 2001. So it's not only a program on the paper, it's much more an African mechanism to implement that program. The masterpiece of the strategic tool of NEPAD is EPRM, a very specific institutional arrangement among African countries to decide whether or not to support any economic development plan of any country. Why to consider the EPRM as an instrument in favor of the effectiveness of the economic, social, and cultural right? I finish. First, because it reflects a fundamental commitment in favor of freedom, of the well-being dignity of individual in all society. It is the relevant instrument to accompany the Declaration on Good Political Governance, Economic and Enterprises signed by the African head of state. The principle underlined being the human development and human rights. The EPRM, therefore, includes fundamental freedom related to the satisfaction of basic needs, the right to work, the possibility of not suffering hunger or malnutrition, to avoid disease or to escape premature death, freedom and economic freedom, financial means to move in the right direction, etc., etc. It, in the end, gives the continent the responsibility of its own destiny, and all economic programs have to be related to the general principles, which are so far from the Washington consensus. And this is where the partnership between Africa and China is so important. This is not in the paper. It's just because China is a real challenger of the Washington consensus, and China is very active in supporting the NEPAD. It has become the first financial of Africa, not only in FDI, but also in assistance. Stock is 80 billion US dollar. And I know by my French and English partner in Africa that whenever there is a Chinese company in a country on any project, the financing is there when the Europeans have no the finance, and most of the ultimate decisions are taken on that background. And what China do is China has accepted the NEPAD principles. And there's no project which is not under the peer review program, APRM, which means that if Ethiopia has a project, need the finance, or even get the finance, it will be discussed under the peer mechanism, African peer mechanism. So thank you. I'm sorry I could not read all the text. It was 29 pages. I hope that I actually deliver the main message of Cherif Salif, which I say is clearly Marxist, not clearly. He say and he stick to a Marxist approach, and is a pragmatic Marxist. So that even if NEPAD is not the first choice, the best choice, because it's still within the capitalist globalization, I think that it is a real progress for the continent. For the first time, he is in charge himself under clear guidelines of its economic, social, and political development. Thank you for your attention in behalf of Cherif Salif. Are we on time? Oh, tea is not far. Sorry, 5 minutes late for the tea. There won't be any Q&As. You agree, no? I'm not Dr. Cherif. I will not able to answer your question. But here again, the paper will be available, I think, very soon, so that you can refer to that paper. It's really, again, a game changer. What happened in Africa since now 17 years. And I can tell you, from India, I travel now very often to Africa, and I can see the race between Africa and India has been for the last 10 years in favor of Africa. Not only the growth rate, but education, gender equality, etc. And I think it's largely thanks to that NEPAD approach. Thank you.